Hello everybody, and welcome to the Threads stream for September, the first live workshop for September. And today, hopefully you will already have seen, we have a value study, slightly complicated than the last ones that we've been doing over the last couple of streams. So building on what we've already done. And this time, the complication is firstly that we've got something that's kind of quite complicated a complicated shape to paint. Secondly, it's complicated because one of the local values is very near to white, so we have to manage that highlight and the overall values of the light part of it. And thirdly, because it's got two different local values, one dark and one light. So I'm going to be getting pretty much straight on with things today, so do let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay and if you can see me okay. Hopefully all is good. I've got my tea, so I'm sure we're going to be fine. And what I'm going to take you through today is basically how to simplify down what looks at first sight to be a very challenging and complicated subject. Hopefully it all looks to me like everything's working, so do let me know if we're all right. I'm going to switch over to the camera on the panel, bring the palette up, and let's have the reference photo up too. Now you would have seen, hopefully you would have seen already that I've also posted a version of this with a Photoshop filter on it, which is called, if you have Photoshop, it's in the filters menu, and then I think it's Pixelate, and this one is called Mosaic, and you can set the size and the number of the squares, which is incredibly useful. Because it means you can really simplify the values down. And especially for this kind of approach that we're using, where we have these simplified value scales. So I've got my 5-step value scale out, ready. It really helps to refer back to the pixelated version if you're unsure about where in the value scale any part of the subject lies. So I've got titanium white, ivory black, a middle value, pretty neutral, so the middle values have got some raw umber in them too. One value between these two and one between these two. Hello? Helga? Hello, Nicole. Nicole is painting along, that's great. Lorraine painting along too, great stuff. Yes, Alison, you've got a name. Yeah. Hello, Olga, good to see you. Sirka's here. Sirka's painting along. You always paint along, don't you? Suzanne's got her name set. Brilliant. Hello, Heather. Yeah, I think it's the 6 o'clock club for us. For everybody else, it's like the 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock club or something like that. So do let me know if you have any problems with the sound at all at any point, or with seeing what I'm doing. I'm going to start, as I usually do, by getting a chunky brush and putting a layer of oil on the panel. Now this panel is an ampersand gesso board panel, basically a factory made acrylic primed hardboard panel. Fine for doing finished paintings on, I think, and also really, really good for studies. It's not actually necessary for the core of what I'm going to be taking you through today to paint into a couch like this, but I find that increasingly now it's just become my default kind of method of approaching things. So I'm going to go into that with a little bit of the middle value, because once I've wiped that off, it's going to be a lot lighter. Now, if any of you were on the flower workshop on Tuesday, this is slightly different. With that one, I wiped off the oil first and then painted into it for the wipeout, because you want to leave a lot of the tone on the canvas, on the painting surface when you're wiping out. For this, I'm not so bothered about that, so I put the paint on, so I've got a mixture of pigment and oil, and then wipe it off. So I want a thin layer of oil. You don't want too much on there. Mostly because it just takes forever to dry. And it's still, so there's a thin layer of oil on there. I've toned the panel, so immediately I can see the values that are going down better. Hello Diane, good to see you. Hi Mariana, nice to see you. You're not terribly late. Dark orange, that must be so scary. You've got the fires over there, haven't you? That must be so scary. Lena, good to see you. Great to see your painting along too. So I can still wipe out, lighter than that if I want to for any of the lighter values. But it's basically nicely toned panel. So I was gonna lay out the drawing before I started today, but I thought, you know what, being as this is a fairly complicated subject, I thought it might be a good idea for me to actually show you the laying out of the drawing in the initial stages too. So I'm going to start by laying out the grid. Now, if you've seen me do this before, you know I generally do these by eye just because it's such good practice measuring distances. It's good practice for holding the brush, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely unnecessary, and if you want to, or if you have already laid out your grid by measuring it, that also is fine. Mine is unlikely to be perfect. What's a good approach actually with this is to put the line in and then measure it and see how close to exact you've come. It's because then you get some feedback, which I'm very keen on as a basic kind of process of practice. And you can see if you generally estimate your measurements too large or too big, too large or too small. Okay, so I'm going to approach this in a method that you will probably be fairly familiar with by now. I'm going to do it fairly quickly, assuming that most of you have already got it laid out. I'm going to mark the top point, the bottom point, which is going to be about here. About halfway down this square, something like that. The furthest right point, which is the handle, which is, I'd say it's probably about there. The furthest left point. Now, interesting thing about jugs, and this one is not an exception, is the spout will usually come out slightly more than if it's like a bowed jug like this, will come out slightly more than the kind of the bow. So what I want to do is I want to find the furthest left and furthest right points of the main body of the jug, and there's one here and there's one a little more than halfway over here, right? So once I've got that, then I can find the point in the middle between the two. So all of this is just judging by eye. You can test that very quickly if you want to. And the reason for doing that is because it's going to really help you drawing out this shape if you break it down and have a center line, which is going to be something like there. So actually the bottom point of the jug, the furthest point south, if you like, is going to be there. So the jug bows out on this side to its widest point about there. So it will be about the same here. And it's more important, I think, that you manage to draw out a shape like this symmetrically than you get it exactly right. Obviously, you want to get it close as you can. So I'm going to allow for that little extra rim at the bottom, the little extra bit that it's got there, okay? And the shape of the jug, it kind of goes down and then straightens out a little bit, so it has like a bowed shape, but already we've kind of got quite a bit of that established. So the bottom bit of the bow is about here. So if I take that measurement and reproduce it up here, allow for it the kind of the perspective on it, and we're going to end up with a shape something like this. Now I would do it in straight lines rather than try to do the curve straight away. It's, generally speaking, is a much more effective way of roughing in curves, and then we want about the same happening over this side. So this is like, really is the most important shape of the jug. If you start somewhere else, I mean, the interesting bits are the handle and the spout, but it makes a lot more sense if you start with the kind of the main shape, the main body of it, which needs to be fairly symmetrical. So that will come out down probably like this, around there. I'm imagining the form of this shape, even though I can't really see it, especially in the photo. Then there's this bit, this little extra step down here. Not particularly worried about the ellipses at the moment. I mean, this in any case is mostly a value study, so it's not the end of the world. And then the very bottom part of it is slightly in from there. So we gradually kind of step down, always trying to keep in mind this center line and making sure that we're at the same distance either side from it. And that will help you avoid a lot, in a fairly simple way, a lot of the problems of drawing out a complex shape like this. Does that make sense? Hello Martha, good to see you. No, I'm not. I'm working from the photo, Alison. I'm not looking through the viewfinder. I'm painting it just the same as you would be from the photo. So I basically have the same reference as you do. For these sessions, I'm basically doing them in exactly the same way that you would be doing them. So I know my spout finishes up here, so there's going to be, this is going to come around here, and there's going to be a little, just a little tiny bit of I would do that as a straight line there. And I know this is actually a curve, but I'm going to put it in as pretty much a straight line of that spout there. We want it to be making a simplified version, you know. This is the top here. It's going to come down there. The handle, I know, comes out to here. You see, if you get those basic shapes kind of roughed in and close to right near the beginning, the rest of it starts to come together much more easily. And this line is almost like almost straight. So I build that out of straight lines as well. Enables you to kind of break down the shape of things much better. We've got this little knob. You see that little knob on the top of the handle there, which is a nice, handy little anchor point, which we know is going to come about there, right on this grid line, which is kind of handy. And then I've gone out a bit too far, I think, with that. Just do this with straight lines. I'm going to mark, you see we've got this straight line here, which is the back of the inside of the handle, so I can just put that in. You kind of, you build it up slowly. This is a straight line, it goes almost up to that grid line. You build it up slowly in stages out of straight lines, and you'll find your drawing will tend to work better. Always trying to simplify down. So I'm looking at where this part, this is a complex shape to eyeball, all of this. So I'm looking at where this part clips the grid. But maybe I've gone a bit too far in there. And I'm going to do that as a straight line too. Straight down there. I just want to know overall that things are in the right place, you know. It goes across there like that, another little straight line. And then up to here. It's pretty straight. This part of the spout is obscured by the grid, so I know it comes back here and it leaves the grid about there. So you can look at this triangle here to help you kind of get that shape. It's going to come down just to the other side of the grid line. So always kind of sighting off and comparing, sighting things off against other things and against the grid. The bottom part of this scoop is going to be about here. You quite often find that without the values down, when you're roughing something in, the shape will look wrong, and then when you put the values in, it starts to make sense. Because it's difficult to... Straight line blocking is a great way to approach things, but it's difficult to imagine a shape correctly when all you have is line, because the way you perceive the shape is changed very much by the values. So I'm going to rough in the cast shadow, comes right out to here. I'm interested in this just as a shape. But I'm not going to do anything about the pattern, okay? We're going to approach that in a little while. But I do want to start thinking now about, imagine this as a white jug and think about where the division of the light and the shadow is. So on the handle here, I should probably finish this bit of handle. On the handle here, this bit here is half in light and half in shadow, and it comes around here to about halfway up. This bit here of that little nub is light, and the bit behind it is shadow. So this is shadow, and this is shadow. And halfway around this, think of each shape individually as where the light and the shadow go. We're not thinking about the values yet, just what's in light and what's in shadow. We're imagining this simply as a white jug. We're ignoring the pattern for the time being. So there is actually a little strip of light here on the spout. So we want to keep that in because that's light. So we want to make sure that we've got that there. And then the shadow starts about here. Follow round the shape of the bowl. And then come down. I know these things, they're very gradual gradations as you see them, and they can be quite difficult to see, but this is partly where you're painting what you know as much as what you see. You know that this shadow is going to follow this shape, and you know that it's going to be like 3/4 in shadow, you know. This photo was taken with this jug pretty much in form light. In daylight. And this is all light, but there's a shadow inside it and it goes over here. And then there's a little strip of light down this bit here as it comes down, so I'm going to put that into. And that's it, we've pretty much decided all of this is light, all of this is shadow. Sorry, all of this is shadow, all of this is light. This is shadow and this is light. There's a cast shadow coming from the side of the shadow box which reaches up to about here. So although it seems like a fairly complicated shape, if you break it down, especially if you've got a grid to work with like this, makes the job much, much simpler. So if any of you are drawing this out as you go along, let me know in the chat if you're ready to move on from here. I think I'm going to bring the exposure of the camera up just a little bit. I think it's a little dark. That's probably going to work better. Bring the palette up a bit too. Okay. So if you've got the photos up like on a screen, let me do a quick. Oh no, I've just realised I can't really do. Can I do a screen share on here? No, I can't do one at the moment. I've done because I've got my photo up on a different machine. But basically, if you've got anything like Photoshop or Photoshop Elements or anything that has any kind of photo editing software that has a color picker, and a lot of them do, you can pop the color picker into an area of the shadow of the jug and then compare that to the value scale on the picture. There are obviously going to be changes in various parts of the shadow where there's a little bit of reflected light, but what we're after is the overall shadow of the dark part, not the inside shadow, because that's quite a bit lighter because it has reflected light in it. We want this part here. And it's darker than you would think. It's actually just a little bit below the middle value. This shadow area here is just a little bit below the middle value. So what I would do is take that value, add a little bit of the value below it. We want something that's roughly in between these two. Okay, and I would be inclined to mix that and then put it out separately so you can see it. That's the value we're going to choose for the shadow side, okay? This one here. Now for the light part, this kind of thing is tricky to photograph, for me anyway. No doubt people who understand photography better than me could do a better job of it. But when you're painting something like this jug, you don't actually want to paint the light in your lightest light because you have to leave a little bit of room for the highlight. So I'm going to choose something that's a little bit above this value here. So between these two, so I'll mix a bit of those two together to get the value. And that leaves me a bit of what I call headroom in the values to be able to put the highest value in. My lightest light, which is going to be, I think I want that lighter than that. My lightest light is going to be the highlight. And it's actually, this kind of thing is easier to see, I think, on objects like this from life than it is from a photo, because a lot depends on how well the photo is taken and how well it's exposed. And I'm not a photographer, so I do the best I can. Okay, great. So we've got for our jug, simplifying right down. It's the same approach we always take. Simplify it down as far as you can. One value for the shadow and one value for the light. We're organizing the picture, okay? before we start putting any paint on, we're organising our values. I'm going to want to know the values for all of the background as well. So this value over here is pretty low. This shadow part here is probably going to be like about as close as as low as we'd want to go in terms of value. It's not quite black, but it's very close, okay? So it's between these two, that value there. And you will have seen me do this before where I kind of spot check an area and then another area. So we'll spot check like this area here. We're going to ignore this line at the back. We're going to paint this all the same value, and then we'll put some of this value here and some of this value here and then paint between them. So this is going to be our background. I'm actually going to move this over because I'm going to leave some room here for our values for the pattern, okay? So we're going to have an area of values for the jog, the light part, an area of values for the pattern, and an area of values for the background. So this value here is going to be going here. On the other side, it is still quite dark. It's roughly the same value. If you squint right down, you can see it. It's roughly, this value around here is roughly the same value as this cast shadow, very slightly darker. So we've already got this value mixed here. So I'm just going to take some of that. And that's going to be the value that I'm going to use over here. Okay. So the value for the ground here is going to be lighter here than it is over here because the light is coming from this direction. So it's always going to be lighter here due to light drop off as the light moves further away from the window. So out over this side, we're going to be, it's obviously, if you look at just this area on the photo, it's getting up near the value of the jug, but it's not quite there. It's slightly below this value. So I'm going to take a value that's just a little bit below this one, higher than this value here, higher than that one, but lower than that one, a little bit in between the two. And then as we go over to the other side, slightly darker, not very much. So I'm going to use this value here, the one that we've already got mixed. So that's the background and that's the ground. So we're thinking about all the values that we're going to need before we actually put anything down. Okay, does that make sense? So I want some values for the light and shadow of the pattern. Now obviously when we get to the dark part of the pattern where it's in shadow over here, this side, I'm going to use almost black. So let's put those here on the palette. It's up to you where you do this, but try to keep these values clearly separated on your palette. I'm going to go down almost to black. I'm going to put just a little touch of a lighter value in there. So we're not quite black, just almost there. That's the shadow of the pattern. So although the pattern is a complicated area of the subject, we're still thinking about it in very simple terms, in very simple values. And for the light side of the pattern, I'm going to go just a little bit between these two. So I'm going to use the same value as I'm using for the shadow side of the jug, for the light part of the pattern. So with having them laid out like this, like here's my value scale, you know, you're kind of thinking about the values on your palette before you paint. Here's light and shadow for the body of the jug. Here's light and shadow for the pattern. And you can see the difference in where we are on the value scale. Here's the ground and here's the background. Okay. So a lot of our work is done. If we've made good decisions at this point, and obviously when you're working from a photo, it's quite a lot simpler. than working from life. We've conceptually got out the various areas of the painting that we're going to need already. We're thinking about relationships. And if I was approaching this painting from life, I'd use pretty much exactly the same process. So firstly, I'm going to paint in the background. Now, I don't know what size you're working, obviously. I'm working 8 by 10 here. So I'm going to get a pretty big, this is a Hogg filbert. This actually is a Cornelison's flat, sorry, not a filbert, Hogg flat. So I'm going to do this background area first. So I've got round here, I've got this value, and you see when you put that down, like, I have this experience so many times. It feels almost wrong. It feels so dark. But you know, we've looked pretty closely at this and we've thought about our value scale and where things need to be in the scale. And I know that that's about right. Almost picked up the value for the pattern there by mistake. Just lay that in. I'm kind of keeping this feeling of these flattened out straight lines for the jug as I'm cutting into the shape. You will find actually if you keep those in, even in the final painting, it lends the painting a kind of a strength and solidity. You don't have to by any means, you can do curves, but I would try, if you haven't tried painting with this method before doing curves, paint them as flat lines, even when you're putting the background in around them. Keep that kind of slightly angular feel. So this is very dark all the way over here. Now that we know that these things are in the right place, we can kind of add a little bit of the shape. But again, don't worry about those details. I can just imagine you kind of thinking about, you want to get all of those details in of the way that this shape goes. Don't. Try and avoid it if you can. Do it in a very simplified way. I promise you, you don't need those details to make the form work. And when you're thinking about the roughing out and the value stage, it's better not to think about them at all. Leave them until right at the end. Until you're sure that the overall value balance is working. Now on this side over here, the value I've chosen for that is this one here. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And I'm going to take this all the way down here to the cast shadow. I'm going to paint it as a single value. I know there's quite a lot of gradation in it, but we can put that in afterwards. We need to think in very simple value blocks for now. Keep our straight lines. It makes for stronger shapes. You can always change them more into curves if you want to later on. And it does get a bit lighter out on this far side, so I'm going to paint it just a little bit thinner there, kind of scumble it in. And this area between from one to the other can easily be done just by mixing between the two. And this is another advantage of having this all laid out on the palette, a different area on the palette for each area of the painting. Makes your life so much easier. There's no need to try and finish this to a really high level at this point. The roughness of the brush marks actually will probably help the painting once you work through on another part, get it to a higher level. So I'm going to do the ground now, and I'm going to use a different brush for that. I'm going to use the same kind of brush, but just a different one. So this is the same, it's another Cornelison Hogg flat. These are, what size are these actually? In Cornelissen terms, these are a size 8. Let me just find my ruler and I'll tell you. Because brush, there is no standard for these things. Brush manufacturers use different sizes. In millimeters, that's about 1.5 centimeters, about 15 millimeters wide. It's about a little more than 1/2 inch. So this is a 1/2 inch brush. It's a little wider than that, about half as much again. So the very lightest part here, we've already chosen our value. Keep our straight lines. Don't be tempted to go too much into try and do perfect curves. Your painting will thank you for it. I'm going to leave a bit of space between there because I know that I need to, between this dark value and this light one, because I know that I need to do a soft gradation there. And over this side of the ground is slightly darker. That feeling of the light drop off as we go over here. Notice I'm leaving the cast shadow. I want that to go a little bit darker than that, I think, over this side. Okay. All fairly simple at the moment, nothing too scary. So I'm going to handle this gradation here. And I've got value extremes. I've got something near the top of the value scale and something near the bottom. So I want to cut, in order to do a soft gradation between these two, I'm going to put a value that's somewhere in between them. I'm going to use the dark brush for it. Doesn't really matter which one you use. But if I put in a bit of the value around halfway down the scale, see that? Not very much, just a little bit. And take a soft brush. You can do this, actually I'll just do it with the brush that I'm using and then just hatch across. You'll have seen me do this a lot of times before. Just hatch across and then drag. From inside the jug, drag out. So you can do it, you know, fairly roughly with a brush like this, or you could, if you wanted a really soft gradation, you could use a soft brush to do that. Nice soft gradation. You can spend forever on this kind of thing, or you can just do it pretty rough and it will work fine. But you need to make sure you've got enough paint on there. If you find that you're dragging and you start to see the surface of the panel underneath, then you don't have enough paint on. These kind of brush effects only work when you have plenty of paint on the panel. And I know this looks rough at the moment, but it won't look too bad once we start to paint in the jug. So for this background area, I want to sort out the cast shadow now. That's the next most important bit to do. And then we've filled in this area entirely. Now the cast shadow, I would tend to take a value that's somewhere around here. You know, fairly close, not right under it, but fairly close, and get like a good kind of an average. It's going to be a very low value. It's probably going to be lower than you would assume. And I think actually it's going to match about the value that we used for this part of the background here. because we're basically dealing with the same thing, a cast shadow, and this here is a cast shadow too. This here is a cast shadow, so it's going to be probably slightly lighter than this value, so a value that's somewhere around what we have here. So we can take this, mix a little bit with the other value from our background, and just pop that in. Be strong with these straight lines here against the jug. Don't be tempted to spend too long making those perfect, because part of the point of this is that we can cut the edge of the jug into the shadow. It gets a little bit lighter as it moves away, which we can do fairly easily just by mixing towards the lighter end of the background colours, the background values. Don't worry about the edges for now, just pop it in. And in order to show this better, there's a much lighter part here in the background. So the value that we used at this side was here. So if I take a little bit of a lighter value, so I'm taking the middle value here, the value 5, and I'm just going to put that in just here, just to kind of show that lighter gradation, maybe a little bit lighter than that actually, make it just a little bit lighter. Yeah, I think we want to end up with something that's about a 5, but obviously we're painting into paint. You be the judge of how light you want to go here. You basically want to, by the time you've finished getting this value in here, you should start to feel this already as a cast shadow. I'm going to blend this because I don't want any hard edge there. I want that to be very gradual. And I know I've said this a lot of times before, but it always fascinates me how when you get to this point in a value study where you've got the background, the ground and the cast shadow, if your values are good, you already start to feel that there's an object there because something must be making this shadow, right? There must be something there making that shadow. So your brain starts to imagine already that there's an object. So we want to treat this edge. I'm going to use a smaller brush and a softer one, so that this is a small flat. It's about 1/4 inch, the one I used to draw out with. I'm going to use the usual hatching method, so hopefully you've got enough paint on here that this will work for you. Now the cast shadow, remember, it gets softer the further it moves away from the object that casts it. So we can hatch more here, wide, hatch wide there, and then make the hatches gradually smaller as you move in. And then I'm going to take another soft brush. This is Winsor & Newton Scepter Gold, and just drag. I'm pretty much ignoring the penumbra and I'm just going for the umbre. By all means paint the penumbra in if you really want it in there. I'm personally not too bothered. I do want to sort out this shape here a little bit though, because this should be slightly rounded at the back. So this also needs to be softened, this back edge of the cast shadow. So do that the same way. Hatch and then drag. And I'm not bothered about it being perfect. You know, it's personally, I think it's nice to have a little bit of life in a painting. It's nice to have a little bit of atmosphere and some texture. And at this point, we've got our background in, and you can feel already Hopefully, if you've followed the values fairly closely with what I've done, you can feel already that there's an object there. Let me know how it's going for you. Let me know when you're ready to move on to the jog. This kind of thing working well, these gradations and stuff like that, a lot of it is to do with the amount of paint that you have on the panel or your painting surface and the touch that you use when you drag. So it takes quite a bit of practice to get used to that kind of thing, and you can practice this. You can practice just softening edges. Just get a panel, put down an oil couch if you'd like to, put down some stripes of value. So, I mean, this value scale would be perfect for it. Put down a stripe, vertical or horizontal or both, of each of these values, and then soften them using the same method. Hatch first across the line and then drag. And you can practice it by, say, having it be at the top of the line. So if this was a line between two values at the top, have very small hatches and let them get bigger as you go down, and then drag and see if you can get a nice smooth gradation. I used to practice that quite a bit that way, and you develop a feel and a touch for it after a while. It takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of time, but it's entirely doable. Suruka, is that your cat? It's very, very cute. I'm just looking at the chat box, and I can see your little icon that you've got in there. My old cat is asleep in here. Unfortunately, he's having trouble getting around now. Studio Cat doesn't climb up me so much as he used to, because he can't really climb up anything these days. He's very old and his back legs are starting to go. Okay, we are okay to move on? Okay. First thing I'm going to do is to put in the shadow side of the jug. I'm going to use, what should I use for that? It doesn't really matter too much what you use, because all I've been painting is flowers for such a long time. I'm kind of out of practice with thinking about brushes, but I think I'm going to use a hog filbert for this. You could use a flat, like something like that would do fine, but I'm going to use hog filbert for it. Slightly smaller than the one I used for all of this. And we've already chosen our value, so this is the shadow value and this is the light. I'm not going to paint this area of shadow straight away because that's going to come out slightly differently. So I'm going to do this bit first. And it's going to end up as almost the same value as the background. But this relationship here is going to be interesting because I would like that to be slightly lighter. So don't get too worried about this, just paint it in. Stick to where you put your lines. You can do it with nice straight lines, don't worry about that. And just block it in. That's all shadow. We'll modulate it a little bit after we've done a bit more. If I was doing this as a full colour piece, I would be thinking very much about what that value is, but I would also be thinking about the chroma and the hue as well. But the most important thing would be the value. You see how it makes it easier to plan out though when you have everything laid out simply on your, clearly on your palette. This value here is the same. It's part of the back of the jug there. There's a bit of reflected light coming up to it, so it will go a bit lighter in places, but we'll block it in anyway. I'm not going to do this one yet because there's a lot of reflected light in this shadow here coming from there, so that's going to be a lighter value, same as this value here. We're just putting the shadow side in. Then I'm getting another brush, pretty much the same, another hog fill, but it's going to be fine for this. Probably need to take that background up to that a little bit more. You see, you can hardly see this, you know, you could paint right across that, and I may do. But I think there's going to be a little bit of reflected light up in here. There is, yeah, which is going to make this bit slightly lighter. So for the light side of the jug, we've already chosen that, it's this value here. Don't be afraid to put this on reasonably thickly. Try not to get involved in the details. In some ways, looking at the pixelated version of the photo might help you here and make it easier to see this just as basic shape. So I'm not going to paint all the detail of that in there. I'm just going to paint it as this bit of the handle here. I'm just going to paint it as a straight line. This is the light, remember, that we're painting now. Don't worry about the line that you get between these two. We'll sort that out in a little while too. We're painting very simplified values. It makes us think about, in very simplified terms, about shadow and light. Yes, there's a lot more modulation there than we're actually painting here. But this helps us to be very clear which part of it is in shadow and which part of it is in light. And you'll tend to find that if you don't do this, it's very easy to get bogged down in the values, to focus in on small areas, to overstate those differences and to lose the whole. So this is basically a strategy for making sure that you don't lose sight of the whole. And we haven't gone in with our lightest light. We're saving that still for the highlight. You can put as much as you like on here. You can lay it on pretty thickly if you want to. The only crime you can commit with this is to paint it too thin. So all of this area is light down to about here where we've decided the shadow starts. So I'm going to paint all of this very simplified shapes as light. Try not to worry about the details of the form. Try just to paint simplified shape and values. And then we've got obviously the outside of the handle, so there's this little nub that sticks up. It's probably got a name, but I don't know what it is. All of this is all the same value. It's our light. Don't be tempted to do curves here. Stay with your straight lines. Helps you stick to the shape. And in a lot of ways will make a stronger painting. You can always smooth them out a little bit if you want to. Simplify it down. So we're just thinking, does it belong to the light or does it belong to the shadow? If it belongs to the light, then it's this value. bring this value down, the light value, down here, because this bit is so light. It's a small part, but it's so light. Just where the side of this spout turns towards. You don't need to make any difference here to show it here, because it will end up showing when we put a bit of a shadow in here and when we put the shadow in here. So what we want now is our lighter shadow areas. So that's like in here. This is lighter shadow because it's a form shadow, but it also has reflected light coming into it. So in this shadow here, light is coming down here into the spout, and the inside of the spout reflecting back into the shadow. It's also reflecting back onto this part of the handle, and this shadow here coming down the cup, the handle. Sorry, the light is coming down, and that also is a form shadow, but it's hitting this surface and bouncing back into the shadow, so it's quite a bit lighter. I think it's probably lighter than the middle value, lighter than the middle of the rain. So I'm going to mix another value just here. I'm going to take a bit of middle value. I want it to be between these two. Some of that one. It needs to be noticeably lighter than this value which we have for our main shadow. What we're basically painting now is the reflected light. I'm going to use the same brush. And again, I'm going to paint this in a very simplified way, but be careful here, because we want to show that there's an edge of the spout here which is facing the light. So you don't paint right up to the shadow or you'll lose that form. It's right there. You see just that little bit there? And that's all you're going to need to, your brain will make up the rest of it. So try and get this shape, keep it simplified, try and get it right in a very simple. And this part here, when you see this edge, there's a strip which is facing towards the light. So we need to make sure that we keep just that little bit there. Paint the shadow in. Don't worry about the transition yet. Like, don't worry about this transition, we'll deal with that. And then around here, there's some reflected light too, so I'm going to paint that in. Reflected light is really, a lot of the times, is what makes it live. And this lighter shadow is going to go all the way down the handle too. And I'm pretty much keeping straight lines still. And it's starting to come. It's lighter value, I think. Missing a bit here, so I'm going to... Inside this general light area, it's going to be darker here and it's going to be lighter here. So we'll put some of that into that. I'm going to put in a little bit of modulation. So I'm going to mix, where I've got, this is our general light colour, I'm going to mix a little bit of the value below it, not too much, because I want to make sure that this stays as belonging to the light, just a little bit lower than the value that we chose. Okay. I'm going to bring this in. But I'm echoing this shape still, echoing this shape of the shadow. Sure that I'm going to bring a little bit of that same value in here because this is a grad. So this gets a bit to. And then we can treat these edges, a little bit of hatching, dragging. I'm going to use, actually for this bit around here, I'm going to use this wider brush. It's fairly evenly softened. I'm going to hatch across. And then drag. You really don't want to overdo this and make it perfect because it will start to lose life. A bit of texture is good. I'm not actually going to bother with that one, as fine as it is. I will get a smaller brush, and down the handle I'm going to do a bit. You don't actually, I mean, you could leave this like this. I think it's working perfectly well. I'm going to soften that a little bit, just in places. And even with just a small amount done like that, you can see it's starting to come. Now, under the spout, like around here, we have a bit of reflected light. So I'm going to use the shadow brush that I used to paint this shadow side in, but I'm going to use this lighter value. Now obviously as I put this down, it's going to mix with what's already there. So it might not end up light enough, we'll see. But let's put in, all the way down there is reflected light. That's probably too light actually. But that's coming up, it's bouncing back from somewhere over here, probably bouncing up from the ground. Don't go down onto this area here because this area is facing away from the ground, so there won't be reflected light. I'm going to paint it in a bit so it's not too, mix it a little bit more with what's there. Still painting really simplified shapes. I'm going to clean up this shape a bit. I'm going to give it a little bit more of kind of, I'm going to bring that into be a bit of a curve now. Now that we're in and we've got the values in and we can see like how the values are going to work in the painting, can start to think about making little corrections here and there. And this spout bit here on mine anyway, this spout bit needs to come down a little bit into there. I'm going to adjust this a little bit, which is, I think is too high there. But just like small corrections, you know, to the form where I think I've done it quite. Just come out a bit higher, further out there. this edge doesn't matter so much because it's going to be the pattern that shows that edge anyway. I think looking at it, I think this value is too dark. And this should all be pretty much that reflected light value, which would make sense because it's like bouncing off the spout back into this shadow, so this should all be lighter. So you might, when you're at this point and you've got like a bit more filled in, you might want to start looking at thinking about where you want to make some adjustments here and there. Values or the drawing. But you have to be careful about fiddling with it too much because any paint that you put down now is going to mix with what is already there. Not happy with the shape of the handle there, I think we cut. And I'm going to bring it in a slightly lighter value over here. So I'm going to take the light brush and I'm going to paint in with white, but just with a little bit of this value from the light in it, because I don't want to go right up to white yet. And obviously it's going to mix with what we've already got there. And it's just this bit round here is a slightly higher value. Still painting really in simplified terms. Don't think I'm going to put it down here because if you think about the way this shape goes, it's facing away from the light a little bit there because the light is coming down at an angle. Bring just a bit in around there. And it will show here as well. So think of any bit of it which is going to be facing directly to the light. This bit here of the spout, this slight, just a little bit, a thin strip there, that's facing more towards the light, so I'll put it in there. I'm still not doing the detail, I just want the main form. I'm probably not going to put any of the detail in at all. Just paint this as a really simplified study. And then again here, this little bit is the same. So this comes down here like this. And then this is the same as facing the light, that little bit there. Now obviously this bit here, little nub is going to be lighter. And this, just this bit round here, the handle is going to be lighter. So we're just putting a little bit of modulation into the lights. Not too much though. And I think this part here of the spout is facing towards the light, but you see this edge carries up around here and this bit isn't facing towards the light. So I'm not going to go right up to the edge of the shadow here. And I'm actually going to make that value there, just this bit here, slightly darker. Because this plane is facing away from the light. This bit here I think will be light as well. And it's starting to get like more of a feeling of roundness now. How are we doing? We okay up to this point? Let me know if you need a bit more time or if you're happy where you are. Don't try to make the jug too finished. Leave it in a fairly basic state. You want it so that if you squint down, you get an impression of the form. I think I've got a little bit of glare on the panel I'm trying to take out. I'm just fiddling a little bit with the shape of the spout. Okay, great. So I'm going to put this in now. I'm going to get a small filbert. But this is quite a lot smaller than the one that I used for the light. And I'm going to get a little bit of pure titanium white. And I say a little bit, like put plenty on the brush. I don't know if you can see that, but there's plenty on there. And you see, like we want to put in some of those little highlights that we can see. And I put these in with thick paint. Don't put them anywhere where you're going to have pattern, but there's one here. They tend to happen at plane changes. And we've kept this part of the value range just for this. I think there's probably going to be a couple here, but I don't want to overdo that. Just tiny little touches, really. It's going to be a little bit here. There'll be a highlight on the nub. But don't overdo them, you know. There is actually one down here in the pattern, but it obscures part of the pattern, so I'm not going to put it in yet. Just tiny little touches, you know, just to show that we've left that little bit of the value range there for that. So let's do the fun part. Let's put the pattern on. Now I'm going to choose, I'm going to use a filbert for this. This is a long filbert. It's slightly smaller than the one I was using for the light and shadow, but not by much, you know. And when we're thinking about the pattern, obviously at this point you're like, oh, I'm going to lose it. You know, if you've got you've got a feeling of a jug there. This is the panic stations part, but we've thought about our values. So the big thing to remember here is not painting perfectly what's there. The most important thing to remember is that this is our shadow and this is our light for the pattern. So if I'm painting the pattern, it's not exactly like that in the photo, but we need to keep this conceptual difference when we put it in. So if I'm painting the pattern on this part of the jug, I'm going to use that value. If I'm painting it in here in the shadow, I'm going to use that value. So I'm going to start with the shadow part. I'm not being fiddly with this. I've got a fair amount of paint on there. And all the way around this edge, there's a dark part, you know. So I'm kind of rolling the brush on. I'm not trying to paint exactly what's there, but I'm also not trying to paint a stroke. I'm trying to give it a little bit of character. Almost down to black. Like I say, don't worry about painting what's there. I've got lots of paint on here. So I'm going to because I need it to completely cover that as well. And I'm going to work right up until I get to the edge of the shadow. And then I'm going to stop. I'm going to put this little bit underneath here in as well. Just do these as fairly simplified splodges. Don't try and paint that perfect. You see how just putting this in changes the way you perceive the values around it. These values start to appear lighter now. But it's better to have painted this shape fully and to have put in all the reflected light before we put this on. So for the pattern in the light side, I'm immediately going to go for my light value. So at this point, I've gone into the light. Be strict with yourself about this, at least in the beginning. As I say, don't worry too much about perfection, just kind of get a rough idea of the shape. Put the paint on fairly thickly so that it covers. And because we've got our two separate values for light and for shadow, we're reinforcing the feeling of three-dimensionality of the jog. These are really just dabs I'm putting down, you know. But because we've thought about the values, it works well as a pattern. If you squint down, if you wanted to, you could try and paint this perfectly. And I've painted this little jug is a favourite of mine, and I've painted it many, many times. And sometimes I paint it like this, very loosely, and sometimes I paint it really carefully. A lot of it just depends on mood, I suppose, as much as anything else. But you can get away with, you know, you try rolling the brush a little bit like this. Just make some textures. Don't try to get it perfect. You know, that's really all it needs. If this was a jog in a larger painting, that would be all it would need. And it seems like it's the bit that should be the hardest, but it's actually, if you keep that separation between light and shadow, forget about the values that are in the photo, forget about the values that are there in life. Choose clear values for your light and your shadow, and it will work. You will almost always assume those values wrong. Don't overdo it, just roll on a few dabs. I'm going to, just looking at it, I'm going to make a few adjustments. I'm going to bring this light area around a little bit further around here. Felt like it needed that. And there's also, actually what I should have done that I didn't do, which I must apologise for, is that obviously on the bottom side of this bowl part, there's reflected light down here. And it's a bit late to put it in now because we've already got the pattern. But I'm going to try and put a bit in now around the pattern. So I'll pick up this value, which is my reflected light value. And this is the advantage of having your palette laid out really carefully like this. This is my light part of my jog. I've got light, shadow, reflected light still. This is my pattern and this is my background, you know. I can always orientate myself within that and put in a little bit of reflected light in here around those dabs of pattern, just to show a little more form down there. All of this down here is reflected light. And it does help, you know, a little bit with the light. And it's funny how it's the last little bits that you put in that make it live, but it's the careful painting that you did at the start actually that makes it work. And it feels like those last little bits are what bring it to life. It's really all of the stuff that you did at the beginning, thinking about the values, planning it, being very careful. I'm just fiddling a little. But I'm not fiddling with detail, I'm fiddling with form. where I think I need to show the form a little bit better. How are you doing? My pattern on my painting is a lot less dense than the one on the actual. But I just wanted to have enough in there to show you how it works. You could spend forever on that pattern, but as long as you remember not to lose this clear separation of light and shadow, it's the key to this, to all of it, is keeping that clear separation of light and shadow. I'm mostly making just changes to drawing and a little bit to main values here and there. And breaking some of these straight lines down into curves a little more. Not good. It then was less good than it was. There's that last highlight which is over here, which obscures a bit of the pattern. I'm going to put that in now. Pure titanium white. Let's roll it. This one up here I think has got two. And that's it. You know, it seems like a very complicated subject, but if you simplify it down, you know, we've simplified down the values, we simplified down the shape, simplified those curves down to straight lines so we could get a lot closer to what's actually there. Simplified the values down to really very simple light and shadow. We've taken all of the detail out of the jog. Haven't bothered with any of the detail, but your eye kind of makes it up. And my drawing's not brilliant on this. I do seem to somehow have elongated it a little bit, even though I used a grid. But hopefully that's shown you how just by really simplifying down into light and shadow and being very careful about values on the palette as well, you can make something different. So we'll see how, once you've finished with yours, post them on the group. We'll see how they've gone, because this is a really fascinating subject to do in colour, this little jog. And I would quite like to do a study in colour of this. What I want to do next, I think we've covered some thank you, Alison. We've covered some basic stuff about value and drawing out over the last few kind of workshop. And I'd like to start thinking about taking it into colour a little more now. And I think a good way to do that is to take some of the subjects that we've worked. So hard to stop. And because you've already done them as value, and do them as colour. No problem, Heather. It's easily done. So this one is a particularly interesting one to colour because the actual jug is not. It looks white. You would say, oh, it's a white jug, but it's a very old antique jug, and it's actually kind of it's a yellow. I making small changes to the drawing, to the form, to bring out the form a little, because the values are good. Possible to worry a little bit about it. I don't know quite how I've managed to get my drawing so bad, especially considering I had a grid. But in a sense, it kind of doesn't matter. The job gives us it. And at least this area is symmetrical. I think it might be partly, it looks better to my eye than it looks on the screen. I think it might be partly because the camera is, it sounds like a terrible excuse, but that's like straight on for me, and the camera obviously is off to the side slightly, so it squidges it a bit of perspective. Just looking at the screen as compared to what I've got, you know, that looking. If you wanted to add a little bit more detail, I would be using the pattern. I'd be using probably something like these, like little rounds. No, use the same value. So here's our light and shadow. So I'll have a separate brush for each light and shadow for the pattern. So here's the shadow. I wouldn't be getting too worried about trying to paint this as it is. I mean, I've painted this very kind of very loosely, and don't be tempted to try and paint it perfect. Do it just these little rounds. If you get plenty of paint on there, you just kind of roll it on. Works really well. Bits of more. It's a way. If the values are good, it's enough to fool your eye into thinking that there's something there that you haven't actually painted. You don't need to paint it perfect. That it's actually, the pattern is it's a dragon. It's a Coalport job. Pottery from, I think the pottery from, not sure how old it is. One of my favourite, and the pattern on it is actually a deep blue purple. But this would be a really nice colour. How are you feeling about your jogs? Was that useful to you? Did it help you to find a way in? Oh no, it's terrible. No, I'm at that stage where I'm looking at it and I keep seeing things that. So, it doesn't really need it. Little things like this shadow should go slightly higher up than it does. It would actually help to show these edges slightly higher. Just little things, you know. There's a very just a hint of a shadow. So, little details you can start life, but they only work thing over. So that's good value. Clear separation. That's brilliant, Marianne. I'm really glad to hear that. White isn't light enough, right? You mean the general value of your light? You've got the photo, you know, so you can easily run through this one again, you know, as many times as you like, and redo the values. But the key is absolutely is at the very simplified stage, getting those values right. I want to soften this here because this is a bit. I think a lot there's a dare I say this, that there's a kind of a fashion in painting of putting swipes in brushes, and I think you should only, and they're just, people tend to put them in random places, and they work when they make sense. You know, so if you want to soften an edge, like a little swipe like that can work quite well. If you just put one in just as a random thing, personally, I find it a little bit forced and mannered. It doesn't help the form. It works against it, and I think, I mean, it looks kind of flashy, but quite often I think it can work against the painting too. There are places, you know, where it does make sense. Here, this edge here, between the light and the shadow, that wouldn't be that hard because it's a curve. You can, you know, just gently, a little bit, and it will work. It'll help the form rather than destroying it. Oh yes, I will. Sorry, Marianne, I hadn't realised I'd done that. I realised I hadn't sent the one without. I meant to put all three in. I realised I hadn't sent. So one thing that I would do, like if you wanted to do one of those sweeps, you see a lot, a really good place to do them, rather than just doing it any old place. There's a lost edge here, where the background can be the same value as the shadow there. There, I would quite happily just sweep across it. Paint that edge. You'll still see it, even though it's not. Still feel it. And I'm still not entirely sure why that is, but it seems to really make things just gives it a. So yes, I will. I'll post the other one in the Facebook group, and I'll also. So thanks very much for coming. Do stick your main group. Yeah, me too. Time to go, and I'll next see you 2 weeks' time. I think probably will be a good time to start diving into. I'm not saying that this will be the last of the study. Come back to it. Think it start about translating some of the value learning. Okay. Thanks very much.